real name is... Spider-Man's name is Peter Parker. What the
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Untitled Model Project. I am your host Tanner Dykstra, joined as always by my two mourning friends, Abram and Tucker Hazel. We are, of course, mourning because we are talking about the film Spider-Man Far From Home, which is the first one that picks up after Endgame, our first one post-Endgame, a post-Endgame world for us and for the characters of Spider-Man Far From Home. We are doing this, of course, in preparation for Spider-Man No Way Home. If you want to watch that and any other Marvel video game, whatever the hell we decide to talk about, you should subscribe to Backlog Banter. And like this video and join the Discord. That link is in the description.
Ring-a-ding-ding bell.
Ring that bell as well. YouTube, maybe the YouTube algorithm is just screwing us over, and that's why we're not YouTube famous yet.
That's true. It really all comes down to that.
I want to throw it over to Abram. You said you had a lot of things to say about Spider-Man Far From Home. Yeah. So enlighten us.
So I saw this movie in the theater. And I think I remember liking it a lot. I don't know, to be honest with you. What I do know after rewatching it is that I don't like this movie very much.
Oh, interesting.
And I do not know why it is so fucking hard to make a good Spider-Man movie. Here's my problem with No Way Home. Okay. I think it is very far from home.
That's going to happen a lot in this video.
And it's probably going to happen on Friday as well. He's going to be like, oh yeah, Far From Home was great. Or bad.
I think that the stuff with Peter and his friends on the trip is great.
Yeah,
I think that this is one of the few genuinely very funny MCU movies. But I think this movie is absolutely crushed under the weight of being in the MCU. I think in Homecoming, being set in the MCU is what helped that movie and gave it a sense of place. But here, I think the MCU absolutely flattens this movie. It puts the focus on Nick Fury and on Iron Man and the blip and the ba-ba-da-da-da-da-da, and we just lose sight of it being a Spider-Man movie. And that just feels unfocused. It doesn't feel like it's really about Peter as much as the good parts of the movie are about him. And then there's a dumb Mysterio twist, which we can talk about also, which I think is a humongous issue with this movie. But on the whole, I think this is a fun movie to watch. I think that there's a lot of heart to it, but I just do not think, for me, it holds up very much at all.
Tucker?
So I've seen this movie a couple times, and my opinions sort of fluctuate up and down each time I see it. And unfortunately, I'm on the downward end of that parabola on this time. I was a lot more disappointed in this movie when I watched it because I think this movie works best as an Endgame sequel and not a Homecoming sequel. Watching this movie right after you watch Endgame, you really feel the effects of it. You feel the natural progression of Peter returning and going straight to school and all of that. I feel like that connection works very well. But coming off the heels of Homecoming, I think there's a very big disconnect there. Peter has experienced a lot of stuff, crazy space world-ending shit in between these two movies, and you do feel that weight, and you feel the weight of the blip, and you feel the weight of Tony's death and all that stuff, which are elements I think that the movie does handle pretty well. However, I think that on the whole, this movie has a lot weaker character moments. I don't necessarily think the group dynamic is fleshed out very well. I think elements like Nick Fury are really shoehorned in. But I do think that the one element of the movie that works pretty much categorically is Mysterio. I think he's one of the best MCU villains and one of my favorite performances. Probably easily my favorite performance in this movie. But still, this dropped below. I think this is a very mid-tier Marvel movie.
Yeah. Well, I find myself in a bit of a strange spot here because I think I'll be the highest on this movie going into it. I enjoyed it the first time I saw it in theaters. I enjoyed it on subsequent rewatches afterwards. And I think I still enjoyed it here. And I think this is probably the MCU movie I've seen the most.
Really?
Yeah, I've seen this. I've seen this at least 4 times now.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. And yeah, I agree with your guys' criticisms in comparison to Homecoming. I think Homecoming does a lot of what this movie does better. You're talking about the group dynamic, you're talking about those character moments. I think you guys have a point with the MCU elements are really sort of shoehorned in, or the MCU elements are more present, more outwardly
Yes.
present than in a lot of other that in Homecoming for certain. But ultimately, I don't feel them that bad. I don't think it's that big of an issue for me, and I'd like to talk about that. But I do agree that I do disagree with you, Abram, there about on Mysterio. I think the whole twist, his whole characterization, the way that they decided to implement him in this film is very interesting, very unique for the MCU. So we'll talk about all of those things.
Sure.
But where would you guys like to start?
I want to start with Mysterio, actually.
Yeah,
Okay,
why
fine,
not?
sure.
Because I think Mysterio kind of sits, for me, kind of at the nexus of a lot of my issues with this film. Because I don't dislike Mysterio conceptually.
Sure.
I actually think he's very interesting, but I
Mhm.
think he's in the wrong movie entirely. First of all, I'm a humongous Jake Gyllenhaal fan. I don't care what Taylor Swift says.
Taylor Swift fans be damned.
I've always liked Jake Gyllenhaal. I think
He's
he's a
my
great
stinky
actor.
boy. I
Yeah,
love him.
he's all of our stinky boy.
But my problem with him in this movie is what most people say about Homecoming. He is a Tony Stark villain. He is really not a Spider-Man villain. And I understand the by proxy relationship. Tony is stepping into the shoes of Peter stepping into the shoes of Tony. But I just feel like this movie, more than the last one, feels so encumbered with other characters' narratives
Sure.
that Spider-Man gets lost in the mix. Because I'm already a little bit shaky about like shoehorning in these people into Stark's empire. He was like off camera, always like it's interesting. But
I agree with that
Yeah.
one shot where he's presenting fucking Barf in Civil War. It's like, shoom, actually, he was here the whole time, and it's like done in this dramatic way where the screen goes fucking black and white and like pauses for a second. You're like, that's a really like that. That's the moment I think where the weight that other people complain about, I can see why it's really forced. Like remember Iron Man 1 and like zooming in fucking freeze frame and like, wow. And I'm like, okay, guys, all right, you could have just said it. Like, you don't need to go this far. But personally, I think that the interconnectedness makes it slightly more compelling because if his crew that is creating this tech-based Mysterio, which I think is a very interesting concept, is just a crew of generic bad guys that have no connections or no reason to really exist other than they're working for Mysterio, that falls into the tropes of very poor villain characterization that lots of comic book stories have, is this guy exists to be evil.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of logic and reason and history behind why this team comes together, why they choose this sort of thing to present Quentin Beck as Mysterio and the alternate universe thing and the death of Tony Stark. There's a lot of ideas going on here, and while I can agree they're ham-fisted in that twist scene and moments, I think on the whole it works really well and connects it to the greater universe in a way that honestly you don't really expect a lot of the time.
I know, I totally see where you're coming from. It just feels like it's the wrong movie to do it in, because Spider-Man has what feels like a really hastily written scene in the bar where he transfers over Edith to Mysterio.
I agree. Yes.
But on the whole, this is not a Spider-Man villain. It is a Tony Stark villain. He's not even threatening New York. It feels like we are so many steps removed from Spider-Man's identity that we lose sight of why this conflict is unfolding in this movie. I love the idea of them going abroad, of Spider-Man having to be the hero when he's on vacation, but it just feels like the villain is not for him.
No, that's totally true.
Entire movie, I just think that the movie's identity on the whole exists to shoehorn Spider-Man into other people's narratives and into a universe opposed to where I think the MCU brought Spider-Man up in Homecoming. It gave him a new New York to step into, and this it feels like Spider-Man is being dropped into an Avengers storyline.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Well, here's what I will say, because fair, lots of people disagree with the MCU's implementation of Spider-Man and how he's not exactly the New York superhero. He's an Avenger first and a Spider-Man second. Is primarily what the MCU uses him for. Disagree with that what you will, but that's the story that's the hand that we're being dealt with the MCU. To that end, I don't feel the criticism that you guys have about I can talk about the bar scene in a moment, but I completely blanked on basically everything you guys just said.
Not very memorable arguments. I certainly understand, but No, I
there's a lot of things levied there, but let's talk about like him going abroad and like fighting someone else's battles. Sure, okay, so they're very clearly putting Peter Parker on this track to be the next Tony Stark. I think Tom Holland just had a quote today where he's like, "Oh, I don't know if I'm gonna be the face of the universe like Robert Downey Jr. was," but so maybe there's some meta conflict there as well with what Tom Holland wants to do. But that's the track that they're putting Peter Parker on. And disagree with that what you will. I think that they did a good job in Homecoming setting up Tony Stark as Peter Parker's mentor. That is paid off, or that is shown again in Infinity War and Endgame. That track is there, so that it makes sense that it's not a logical jump from when they take Peter in Homecoming to where Peter is in Far From Home.
Yeah.
Having to deal with Tony Stark's messes, and that plays into his character arc of like, are you gonna be the next Avenger? Who's gonna lead the Avengers? What if the aliens come back? He's like, what about like friendly neighborhood Spider-Man stuff? Peter Parker in Far From Home is so clearly nervous and even opposed to taking on this role, but it's the role that he has to take on, and to the point of him not being in New York that much. New York elements almost at all. The New York elements were great in Homecoming, but I feel like they're taking him in a very different direction. Like, that's the little seed where Peter Parker started out in the MCU, but now we're expounding him to be, he goes to space in Infinity War, he's in the big Thanos battle at the end of Endgame, he goes abroad in Far From Home, he's doing multiverse stuff in No Way Home. The seed was New York, but I don't think the MCU wants Spider-Man to be tied to that. And disagree with that if you will, but that's where they're taking him.
I actually like that idea, though. I think there would have been a really fun version of this movie where the film was not encumbered with the Avengers stuff. It was just Spider-Man being Spider-Man in London and juggling his identity still in his relationship with MJ. But I think my problem, Tanner, is that the MCU Spider-Man is at turn after turn removing his relatability and putting him into a framework where I think we lose core tenets of who Spider-Man is. I don't think Spider-Man doesn't need to be in New York to be Spider-Man.
Sure, yes.
But I think as soon as you tether him to Nick Fury and then you tether him this strongly to Tony Stark, we lose who Spider-Man is as the character. Because I think the movie is at its most fun when we are with the class and he's trying to sneak away and the relationship with MJ is developing. But then all of a sudden when Spider-Man is in the secret base with Maria Hill and all these people and we're fucking fighting all of these big elementals before we realize the elementals are fake, or there's a bajillion drones over the Tower Bridge in London. It just it feels like we're getting so far away from the appeal of Spider-Man opposed to the appeal of these other heroes. That I just feel like we're losing that identity.
Sure.
One thing I would say, actually, just thinking about through how people criticize the Iron Man connection and Spider-Man being his own character, is personally, I see the Spider-Man character and the way that Spider-Man as a character has been iterated on so many times throughout history as the core idea being the great power comes great responsibility thing. Fucking believe it or not, I know it's insane. And the heart of a hero in someone who wants to do good. That's what I see as a Spider-Man storyline. Now, this, I think I agree with Abram on the fact that it's over encumbered in trying to explain that and adding in shield elements and all sorts of stuff that don't really connect to Peter Parker as a person. But I would disagree that we're losing the Spider-Man tenets, because the idea of placing this responsibility and weight of the legacy of Tony Stark on Peter Parker's shoulders is actually kind of the ultimate but ultimate end of the great power comes great responsibility thing. He's the Earth hero at this point. Like, almost all the main Avengers have left or have gone undercover or fucking done whatever the hell. He's one of the only ones that is active, and people recognize that. And through that merit, because they're so used to having Cap and Iron Man and their legacies be so prevalent in this universe, that's all placed on his shoulders. And I think working that into his character and the anxiety that he feels and having to come to terms with being a fish out of water and all these different circumstances is actually a really interesting pushing point for like continuing to further this character in its own direction that isn't just him being in New York. And I know that's not what you were saying, but like these Spider-Man tenets, I think, can be applied on a larger scale that work within the MCU. But all that I think is more conceptually. I don't necessarily like how they're handling it here with how many fucking elements you have to get through with with Shield and traveling around, and Nick Fury hijacking the summer vacation, and Mysterio convincing Shield, and then he knows that Peter Parker's got the thing. Like, there's so many threads that's pulling back this that I think you do kind of lose that core idea. But when you peel back those layers, I think that is there and actually might be really interesting to see play out in a long-term Spider-Man character, which we're getting. We have another trilogy planned for this fucking guy. And I think that watching him come to terms with being the big superhero of Earth is actually really fascinating, something really exciting for Spider-Man, because we don't get to see that very often.
Maybe he'll have some conversation with Toby and Andrew in No Way Home.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. That's also another way to spin it with him. Yes. One thing I love is him being able to relate to other characters about superhero stuff, which is one of the reasons I think Mysterio is such a phenomenal character in this.
I agree.
The way that
I like
Quentin Beck, or Mr. Beck, as he keeps calling him at the beginning, is such a gravitated mentor towards Peter because he has this instant respect for him. And the two of them do share that kinship on different levels, you know, depending on how much you think that Quentin is acting in those scenarios, whatever. But I think there's a really interesting connection there that does play up the scaredness, the childlike out of his fish.
He's out of
fish
his
out of water.
Fish, this guy.
Fish out of water element that Peter is in this movie. And I really think that makes Mysterio really compelling. And that twist even more painful, to be 100% honest.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say we should probably talk about Mysterio because we really got lost in the weeds there after we said that we would. But I do really like him. A little bit. We didn't really address the twist or anything like that, which was something that Abram said that he didn't like. So I will say that I do really enjoy that twist. I think the conversation between Peter and Quentin in the bar is very good. I think it makes sense for his character. I don't think it feels rushed because Peter has all of this stuff piling on top of him that I think it makes sense. You know, if you're a dumb 16-year-old, you're like, oh, I can just give the responsibility to this guy. He seems more qualified. He likes me. He seems like he's not lying to me. I'll absolutely give this responsibility to him, especially if you're looking for an out, if you're looking for a solution, and the solution is looking you right in the face with Jake Gyllenhaal's baby blue eyes. You're like, absolutely, I'll give you the glasses. Here's Edith or whatever. So I don't think it feels rushed. I think it makes sense for Peter's conflict, for how Quentin treats Peter throughout the film, and I just like, and I also. That moment in the theater where he's like explaining his whole plan and you see the guy come back from Iron Man 1 and the whole bar dissolves from drone holograms and stuff like that. I think it's all great.
No, I like my problem with Quentin is the fact that he is in this movie, not because Quentin unfolds the way he does.
Gotcha.
I do think I had a lot of problems with the movie at the time for yanking our balls with the idea of a multiverse and then kind of making fun of the idea that there's multiverse in this movie. I think especially for fans of the comics, it's just kind of disrespectful and weird. I never liked that very much. But I actually think that just Quentin as Quentin, like if we had gotten an Iron Man 4 or whatever and Quentin was the villain, I think that could have been really great. But as it relates to Quentin and Peter, I agree. Well, first of all, Jake Gyllenhaal could fucking wink at me, and I'd give him my entire wallet. So I understand what Tom Holland is doing there. But I do think it feels a little bit quick. But I think the entire movie feels quick.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And that's
well, what I was gonna pick up where you were talking before, in the idea of there being a really interesting, almost like power vacuum that Peter has to fill, and the ultimate idea of the great power, great responsibility being the head of the Avengers. I think that this movie is encumbered by being, as Tucker, you were saying, an Endgame sequel too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If we had more time for Peter to develop a relationship, if we had spent more time, because here's the thing, the blip is played for humor a lot of the time here, which I think works. Like I love the fucking show. There's a lot of, I want to talk about the humor. I actually don't want to get sidetracked with that right now. But I think it works well, but it's a very serious thing that gets played, I think, far too much for laughs. But if we had an entire movie that was maybe not a Spider-Man movie, but just an Avengers-ish movie or an interstitial Spider-Man movie where it was more serious and we were dealing with the blip and Peter finds Beck and he bonds with Beck over needing a new Tony and we had taken time to get there, I think that would have felt more earned. It just, again, contributes to this idea for, I feel like Spider-Man was shoehorned into someone else's story.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's 2 points that actually I agree with you entirely on that. there's two reasons why that feel my perspective on this is that I think this movie is really poorly edited on the whole. I think that the moment to moment cutting back and forth between lines of dialogue is genuinely pretty bad. Like it feels like a trailer. Like you can hear their cadences stop and then the reshoot pick up as they're like continuing the conversation. Like, oh fuck, oh this is really awkward, and that makes a lot of the delivery of those more emotional moments not really hit for me. And also, I think that this feels like a movie where, like you were saying, we're missing a middle part. We're missing the other Spider-Man in New York story. We're missing the part where Aunt May has to deal with him being Spider-Man. We're missing the part where he gets to actually know MJ and start to like her and all this stuff. We pick up here because we're picking up after Endgame. We need to finish up what Endgame started, but not necessarily picking up the threads that Homecoming started. So it's like there's a time gap there that does feel a little bit strange. Like presumably, and this is an entirely different can of worms you can open or can't. We don't know how many villains Spider-Man has faced in his time since Vulture. We don't know what kind of experiences he's had between these adventures, but because we never saw them, him jumping straight from Vulture to Infinity War and Endgame, then to this, there's a whole like home base thing there that we never got to see. And playing into a whole future set of movies, 5 more movies or whatever, they could play that out over the course of that. But this jump from Homecoming to Far From Home is very vast, and it does not feel natural. And I think that's a lot of my problem with it.
Sure.
Can I also just say, Tucker, if we're going to speak about bad editing for a second, the fucking scene where he's making the suit and Back in Black is playing, but you can neither properly hear the song nor what Peter is saying. There are,
really?
I think.
What do you mean?
Yeah, like they're trying to play Back in Black, but he's talking over it, and so you can't appreciate either the homage to Tony or what he's saying. I do think that there's little weird technical problems like that do undercut moments that should be really great.
Yeah,
the movie sometimes just feels too heavy-handed, and it feels like the filmmaking isn't quite there to match them.
Yes, 100%.
So,
which is not a problem I felt with Homecoming at all.
No, I think Homecoming is just such a tighter movie.
100%.
Sure. Okay. What else?
Humor.
Yeah. Let's talk about the humor a second.
And the characters.
Sure. Yeah, the other characters might as well. Well, we can tie those intrinsically together because your jokes come from the high school element of it all, the high school vacation trip.
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah.
For the most part. I think what's there is all good. Obviously, you get less than Homecoming, which you guys really have an issue with, and I think makes sense for the story that the film is trying to tell. That that's the B and Shield stuff is the A plot. But I think it's still fun. I love the about Ned and Betty having this like very complex, meaningful relationship that they formed on an 8-hour flight to Venice or whatever. I think that's great. It's not so much humor, but I really, really love the chemistry between Tom Holland and Zendaya. I love all their moments together. It probably is the most attached I've been to a MCU couple watching an MCU film. I felt that in the theater, and I still feel it now. And I mean, a lot of those MCU couples are like, well, we need a female co-star, so I don't know, Rachel McAdams in Doctor Strange. But I really enjoy Zendaya. She feels more awkward in this because she also likes Peter, and like they're both sort of dancing around this, and they have jokes with like Bo and stuff like that. It's all very cute and fun moments that I think permeate all the high school moments in this film.
I agree 100% with you.
Yeah.
And this is why I think this movie frustrates me so much, because I think you could have told this story where the trip was the A plot and the B plot was not a Shield clusterfuck, but Peter coming to terms more emotionally with the death of Tony and all of this, because you see like the vigils for Tony all over the place and all this stuff. I think you could have centralized the fun high school stuff, but have this more serious undercurrent that addresses Endgame thematically without all the nonsense, because that A plot, if it were the A plot of going to the trip, is so much fun. I love the fucking chaperones who take them on the trip. I genuinely think that this movie's humor hits way better than most of the movies do. I was actually laughing out loud while I was watching this, and that rarely happens for me.
Yeah.
This movie is also a huge victim of intercutting jokes where they don't belong. Like the scene where
Yes.
Nick Fury and Peter are trying to have a conversation,
God.
and fucking Ned gets shot, and then there's a knock on the door with the counselor,
There's 4
and
fucking knocks on the door.
Betty, and all of this. Like, I think it does go too far, but the ratio of
There's
good
only
jokes
3.
to poor ones,
Doesn't matter. That's too many.
it's too many. But the ratio of good jokes to poor ones, I think, is far better here than it typically is. And because of that, I had a lot of fun with London. Although I think, Mr. Hazel, would you like to rebut that?
Yeah, I think this is one of the least funny MCU movies because I think it is one of the few that foregrounds the fact that it knows that it's a comedy. A lot of the funny parts of Avengers or Iron Man or even Homecoming are naturally woven into the scenario of situation dialogue or a situation that the characters are put in. This is one of the few where there are very clear pauses for comedic effect. Like they stop so they can give the audience time to laugh, or it's the music stops because someone's going to knock on the door, or it's Happy saying, "Oh, I'm in love with Spider-Man's aunt." Like there's these moments that they feel created only for a joke, not because the characters are responding with funny things in whatever situation they're in, which I think is true for most MCU movies. This takes that comedy to a place that feels like an Adam Sandler 2000s comedy that really ends up frustrating me and feels pretty fake for these characters.
I kind of disagree. I think every MCU movie has that, where a character, the comedic relief character will say something weird and all the characters will stop and, oh, what did he say? Every MCU movie has that. And maybe it just stuck out to you more in this because they do it more because this is they decided to take, with the success of Homecoming, they decided to take Spider-Man in a more overtly comedy movie, high school comedy sort of track. Yeah. So there is probably more like this is a period of time for 10 minutes where like there's jokes every so often or whatever.
Yeah.
Where that might not be as set aside time in other MCU films.
That's why it worked for me, Tucker, opposed to the other movies in large part because the humor here felt very deliberate. I feel like my problem with the humor in a lot of MCU instances is because it's tonally inconsistent with what's happening in the scene. I think because a lot of this movie plays itself primarily as a comedy in terms of just the genre, in terms of how the script is written, I found myself laughing along more because it didn't feel like we're trying to have an emotional moment that was then undercut by a joke. It still happens here more often than I like it to. I think the blip stuff is a great example of that. What is a very serious part of the MCU that we don't really ever get to super address is little scenes like the support group we see at the beginning of Endgame, or little things like the Thanos was right in Hawkeye. But there are moments where I should
watch Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Legitimately for blip impact, that's almost the entire show.
Okay, then I'm planning on watching all those shows now. I'm too far into Hawkeye. I feel like I have to watch all these fucking MCU TV shows now. But I think on the whole, the fact that this is actually a comedy, the comedy hit better for me.
Sure, yeah. The one thing I do want to mention that I think is one of the elements that is sort of middling for me, because I can see what they're going for, but I don't think it hits a lot, is the action. I think there's a lot of creative ideas here, but more often than not, the elemental fights just devolve into CGI gobbledygook in a way that doesn't feel very compelling. Like Peter is stopping the water monster and the fire monster and the wind monster because his friends are in danger, not because he has a personal connection to it or whatever. I think that there is a version of this movie where Mysterio is more clearly manipulating these and all this stuff. All the tension of the action fights come from the relationship between Peter and Quentin and not necessarily the scenario that they're put in. And because of that, I kind of find almost all the action sequences in this movie very mediocre, except for the Mysterio fight where he's manipulating him. I think that ends up spinning it 180 that I think it really ends up working.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I do really... I think we neglected to talk about the Mysterio sequence, which is, like, probably one of the most, like, I don't want to say daring, but, like, creative sort of avenues that an MCU film has ever taken for, like, a set piece or a scene. Is it a completely CGI, or we're swapping out visuals? He falls into a thing, and now he's in a snow globe, and there's a zombie Iron Man crawling out of a grave. It's all really interesting visuals, and we've never gotten anything like that in an MCU movie before. And I think that speaks more to this film's very good utilization of Mysterio as a character, and all the powers that come intrinsic with Mysterio. But yeah, I do really like that scene. If that's what you were talking about, Tucker, with
that
manipulating
sequence
scene.
is the one good one, is what I'm saying.
I like it. I think it's a little bit showy and too long for me. I think it does a nice job like recontextualizing itself, of tricking Peter into thinking, Nick Fury is there, or to get the information of where's Betty and Ned and all of them. Again, I think that another part of the reason why Spider-Man is fun is because he's fighting a more ground level threat often. But this is just so far beyond that, and I think it gets even more faceless than most of the MCU CGI clusterfucks become, because at the end of the movie, we're literally just fighting drones, and Spider-Man is literally just dodging every drone bullet. It ends up feeling very hollow for me, but I do actually like how Peter uses webs in this movie, which is like just kind of a little detail, but making like tricking the drones and flying through them, trying to catch the bell tower. I think that they do a nice job with that, but it actually goes back to what Tucker was saying earlier, where I feel like we don't quite see Peter develop those powers in a way that it really feels earned when he does them. So yeah, I'm right there with you in terms of the action on the whole, I think.
And also because the Peter Tingle thing is a fucking F level plot in this, and is not paid off in any particular way.
Well, I always thought that was weird, because like we see him utilize his spider sense in Infinity War. Like maybe he doesn't know what it is, and
apparently it's supposed to be post Endgame.
Yeah,
that his powers aren't working because he's stressed, but they don't call enough attention to that.
No,
where
that's not...
that final thing where he is closing his eyes and flipping dipping through all the fucking drones. It's not that impressive because he's been dodging all that stuff already throughout the course of the movie, and you never really felt like. I mean, he got hit with a banana once, but like that's really the only instance that it really feels like something's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's more a conscious choice, because like Aunt May says you can dodge bullets but not bananas or whatever, and maybe that is just like a subconscious thing, like his. We're getting in the weeds of speculation now, but like he just can just like subconsciously know when he's in danger, but when he tries to actively like, okay, I have to jump through all these drones and stuff, then he has to sort of forefront it in his mind.
Could be.
Yeah.
But I just think the film doesn't have enough time to explore things like that.
100%.
Okay.
Last thing I would say, let May and Happy fuck. Hey,
you know what?
That's where I want to end.
Well, last thing I want to say though, one of the best post-credit scenes of all time.
Yeah, absolutely.
With 3 different reveals. Fucking awesome. Good God.
It's very good, but also ultimately, like, there's no point in talking about it, because now the premise of the next movie is making sure it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
But in the theater, that's probably the most I've ever been shocked.
Oh, sure, yeah. It was a good moment before the MCU decided they didn't like it anymore.
As we pull up our super secret document to give this a score, I will say that I think what it really comes down to here is that carryover from this being like the stepping stone into Phase 4 is still what makes me excited when I think about this film. It's what I felt excited for when I came out of the theater. Like, oh my god, all this new stuff in Spider-Man.
Sure,
he's like the hero. He's like the top hero of the MCU right now. And we got J.K. Simmons. His identity has been revealed and all this stuff. And Nick Fury's in space. Where is all this going? And maybe for you guys it falters under a lot of that weight. But for me it just doesn't. I enjoy every single element of this film, no matter how much time is given to each of them.
Sure.
Okay.
Ready?
I've got a number in there.
I got a number in there. 3, 2. Oh shoot! Oh, hang on. I was putting it in the wrong space. Oh
yes.
no!
Very wrong space.
3, 2, 1, go. Oh, a 6.8. Okay. We'll run it down here, right here. So this is our first Spider-Man ranking right now. I am the highest, as you might imagine, at an 8.4. Tucker is at a 7.1, and Abram is quite low at a 4.8.
I think this is below average for MCU, frankly. I think it loses sight of the character. I think it loses sight of the larger plot. This, to me, feels like a better version of Amazing Spider-Man 2 in the sense that it is here to set up and pay off things larger than the character. And because of that, we just get entirely lost in the weeds. And I really think that this is a humongous step down from Homecoming.
Well,
Yes, I mean, it certainly is.
Thanks to the maybe lower quality of other Spider-Man films, this only goes at number 3 on our list.
That's where I have it on my ranking, so perfect.
Below Spider-Man 2, but above original Raimi Spider-Man. But folks, let's peer over to see where it goes in our MCU ranking, since we are doing both. Oh, okay. So it'll go right below Iron Man 2 and right above Thor for 3rd place. Wait, no.
No.
Oh, no, I didn't scroll up far enough. 6th place. 6th place out of the MCU ranking. I had to count.
Between those two movies, I think it feels fair. I think there's a lot of similarities between this and Iron Man 2, actually.
2. Nope, yeah. I'm definitely feeling that.
Well, I disagree. I think that's an inferior film, and this is a superior film. But boys, we did it. We went through all the Spider-Man movies, except, of course, for Spider-Man No Way Home, which we will be reviewing imminently if you're watching this video the day that it comes out, which you should be if you ring that bell and subscribe to Backlog Banter. Folks, I'm excited to get back into MCU reviews. I'm super excited to talk about No Way Home and any other videos that I happen to appear on alongside my 2 good friends here. But folks, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Bye.